Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to be talking about The Maidens, which dropped in June this year. It's a follow-up to The Silent Patient, written by Michaelides. I consume this on audio narrated by Louise Brayley and Cobna Holdbrook Smith, and the narration is quite good. I liked it a lot. I sometimes miss saying that when I'm doing audio reviews, which I'm remiss about, but the audio in this book is great. They have really good tone, inflection, and I think, if anything, they augment the commercial pop fiction-y prose that appear in the book. So it was a good job casting them. This is billed as a psychological crime thriller, semi-drama type book, emphasis on the murder mystery. But I find that there is actually no psychological component that is so predominant that I would label the book in that way, and it points people in the wrong direction. If you say it's a psychological murder mystery, thriller, drama, whatever, the psychological aspect of it, especially being put first, it implies well-rounded characters, and it implies a very firm understanding of mental health, which this book does not actually provide, in my opinion. So something that comes to mind immediately for a psychological thriller book would be the Expanse books. It spends a lot of time with every character really telling you exactly what is going on in their head and what the psychological components of that are, and the ramifications, how they act on their psychological profiles, and what the motivations are, and how those things change throughout the book. And it's all very good, in my opinion. So this book's main character is Mariana. She's also a psychologist. She specializes, it seems, in group therapy, ranging from high-risk people to people that cross boundaries to regular people. We only see her running one session in particular, though, and so maybe that's what they mean by psychological. Her job and her outlook is somewhat driven by her job and her understanding of it. But to me, it just seems like you would be getting more people like me very interested in a psychological component that is being driven, and a through line, which again it does not have. So Mariana is processing grief right now. Her long-term husband has been killed. They went on a vacation, and we know that he has not committed suicide, but he went out on a swim, something went bad, and he died. Now she is alone. She is thrust into her work. She's at least somewhat trying to repair herself of this grief by going to her psychologist, who I believe her name is Ruth. It's a setup in order to show that she's a nurturing, caring person who's grieving, and her outlook is a little bit maybe skewed, as the narrative is first person from her perspective. Her niece Zoe calls her from Cambridge, imploring her to come to her because she's in distress. Her roommate has been killed. Her name is Tara, and she's a part of these Maidens, we find out, who is kind of being run by a professor of Greek studies. And the Maidens, it turns out, is a personal study group of his that he starts, and he may or may not be sort of transgressing and crossing his own boundaries, basically, with his own students. When Mariana arrives, she senses that the police are not really invested in the outcome and are sort of skewed or predisposed to believing a outcome that Mariana and Zoe don't believe occurred. Mariana puts on her detective hat and starts snooping around, unbeknownst to the police, circumventing them, and just trying to come to a truth that she doesn't believe the police will come to. It has a very fast-paced narrative, just like most commercial pop fiction, genre fiction, and it only took me, I think, only 3 hours to get through. It was very quick, and at least if you get about 10 to 15% in. If you're like me, you'll have a guess at who is the killer, and it's worth it just to consume the 2 hours and extra change just to see if you're right or not. And I also gave it a star because The Silent Patient was actually offensive in its portrayal of mental health and mental health professionals and the institutions that they occupy, whereas this feels like it's more respectful. It's tropey for sure, and it's not perfect, which is why the psychological underpinnings sort of bothers me with the book, it being applied to it. But it's still an improvement over The Silent Patient from what I can say. The craft work is similarly not good, though. Without spoiling it, one of the problems that I had with the book is that you're likely to suspect somebody, or at least if you're me, a initial person of contact in the novel, and it does a very poor job of assuaging you of that idea. In fact, everything continues to point to this person. They do add a couple red herrings and say that, there's a couple other motives out there possibly, but it's actually so tight-knit a group and so shallow in motive and opportunity for everybody else that it doesn't really make sense for anybody else to be the killer, and then you're just reading to find out if you're right or not, which is a fine thing to do. It's what I did. Other aspects of it, at a prose level, the characters all sounded exactly the same, from a cop to a professor. All of the men have the same mannerisms and tics. They have the exact same diction. They have the exact same speech patterns. It makes for very bland reading. The sentence by sentence and paragraph by paragraph structure, as you can tell by the narration, is very repetitive and simple, and it doesn't do it any favors. I didn't find it very evocative. There's no active verbs. There's no specificity in terms of description. It just feels like a very generic on wheels story, basically. It's good at getting up and going, but very little else is happening. Characterization is paper thin for everybody, especially Mariana, which is strange. We get a lot of show don't tell problems where the reader is it's almost like breaking the fourth wall, where the reader is basically told what they should be feeling via the character, even though she may not ostensibly be feeling that because it's incongruent with what she's actually doing in the moment. It doesn't really make sense. And as long as you're suspending disbelief enough to buy those tidbits and to actually feel those things that are supposed to be happening, I could see some people liking it a lot more than me, but I'd rather see Mariana be sad than saying that she's heavy in grief, but walking down the street and nothing is happening whatsoever. And then we cut to like a different scene where she's just talking to somebody with no setting the scene whatsoever. It feels solipsistic. It feels very amateurish. It doesn't feel like the author has you and is going to tell you a story. It feels like it's sort of just careening and hitting places. Some of them work, some of them don't. You just have no, if you're me, faith that the author is going to get you to an interesting place. And that's exactly what happens. If you haven't read it, then stop now. And if you do read it, then I hope you find it more interesting and better than I have. Maybe managing expectations will do it for you, but I did come in with low expectations off of The Silent Patient already anyway, so I think this is just a case of me not jibing with this particular author. So, spoiler-wise, does this not work? Right off the bat, the first suspect, if you're me, is Zoe, and she only becomes more interesting as a suspect as it goes along, whereas others, as in the professor, is so sloppily served up on a plate for you that it could not possibly be him. The only outcome that could be worse than Zoe is the professor, because it is so self-evident that the book wants you to think that it's the professor the entire time, because he's maybe fondling these girls, or, you know, going out with them, or forming undecent relationships with them, or whatever. And so, ruling that out, literally the only person that could have done it is Zoe. Like, there's no one else that looks interesting for this. At this point, the only thing that I was reading for is to discover what Zoe's motive was. Then the heavy foreshadowing that takes place in this book really collapses all of the tension around that anyway. At one point, Mariana is having a therapy session with Ruth, and Ruth outright spells it out for her. It tells her that she doesn't see men in particularly clearly whatsoever, because her father, who Mariana initially thought was very loving and kind and a paragon, essentially, their therapy unearths that he is a bad person and displaying all of the qualities that shows that he didn't love her or care about her, and just basically used her to try to validate his own feelings. And so right off the bat with this, we should be thinking that the professor is not the killer, because she does not see men clearly. After the second person is killed, Mariana has a group therapy session with all of the Maidens, and the professor inserts himself in that because he doesn't trust Mariana, but Mariana thinks it's because he wants to control the group, of course. They end up sort of passively bullying her as she sees it. Again, this is all first-person narration and somewhat unreliable, so who knows how her grief and her processing is changing and characterizing what she is seeing and thinking, which is me affording it more than it might be, actually. It's just being very generous. There's a story that's told with these maidens in which, I can't remember the exact Greek reference for the tragedy, but a young girl is essentially killed, which transforms the play into a tragedy. This young girl is later heralded as saving an empire type deal, basically. Like, whatever the outcome is, and it is quite positive for everybody else, except for, of course, the dead girl. And so what this telegraphs to us is that Zoe is going to die in the future, obviously. So knowing these two things, the only real question mark that we have is what is the possible motive for Zoe. And initially it seems like maybe she's just jealous that Tara has it in with this professor, who, from varying different viewpoints, somebody says that the professor was very interested in her and trying to get with her, and other people said that he had no interest in her whatsoever. So it's sort of neutral on that front, but possibly Zoe murdered Tara to get closer to the professor, but then why kill two of them? Then we learn that Zoe is going to be the next sort of person who is inducted into the Maidens, which makes it so that the professor is even more tantalizing as a suspect, which means he's not the killer, of course. So throughout this, it just sort of continually underlines and reiterates that Zoe's the killer. She's going to die, and the motive, we can assume, is to get close to the professor, and maybe the professor is manipulating Zoe to do this, for all we know. And also, her processing of Sebastian's death is probably going to be having some light shed onto it, essentially. It gets even worse than that, though. So it turns out that Zoe was carrying on an affair with Sebastian. Sebastian planned all of these murders ostensibly to get rid of Mariana eventually, and somehow they would be transitioning into being a couple afterwards or something. But regardless of how thin that is, the idea of somebody being the mastermind and the perpetrator who's off screen and we have no psychological profile for, or real motive whatsoever, other than, I guess, old guy like young girl real good, just feels very amateurish and stupid. It's less interesting than the people who are actually present in the story, paper thin though they are, having orchestrated this in some way. In fact, my sneaking suspicion was some sort of weird ritualistic thing that was occurring where Zoe was killing these women in order to impress the professor in a parody of some kind of Greek play or Greek tragedy. And that's more interesting than what happened in the end. So Zoe ends up being the killer. She goes and takes Mariana and is about to kill her, which we still don't know how that plays into Sebastian's ultimate plan, who is now dead. And thank God he didn't come back from the dead, because that would be even worse. But regardless, a friend of hers, Fred, who I think is even present at one of the group sessions of hers that she has run, she finds him as very annoying, like a stalker, essentially. And of course he's stalking her when Zoe is leading her to a knife in which she will kill Mariana with. And so this whole revelation, and of course Zoe tries to kill Mariana, this stalker guy dies, and Mariana manages to push Zoe, and she ends up dying with the knife in her own body. And of course, as we can see, the foreshadowing is complete. But if you think about it, the foreshadowing doesn't actually make sense in the end, because the foreshadowing with the Greek tragedy implies that the girl did something altruistic and helpful for everybody else in the world, and like brought about a specific regime in Greek culture. Whereas in this one, she's just dead, and maybe Sebastian was, grooming her or manipulating her in some way when he was alive. And that's sad, sure, but we never see that on camera. So how can we really connect with that idea? I can't, anyway. So this just signaled to me that the author didn't really know what they were doing with the foreshadowing. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because initially you should feel the satisfaction of foreshadowing, but then when you think about it even more, it becomes a dissonance with the actual events of the narrative, which is not what you want with foreshadowing. So yeah, in the end, nothing about this worked. I think at least it's not overtly offensive like The Silent Patient. So the beats aren't successful, the plot isn't very successful, the foreshadowing isn't very successful. At a prose level, it's not very good. I will not be reading any more from this author, obviously, and I'm a little bit baffled as to why people like it. I guess there's some satisfaction from having a very big twist that you couldn't see coming with Sebastian, even though it is sort of telegraphed in the fact that she doesn't see men clearly. It's much better than him being back and alive and whatnot. I don't know, to me it just seems like it's very overrated and strange that it is so popular. Maybe I've got an inaccurate analysis, or maybe I just couldn't switch my brain off enough for mystery thrillers. I read a ton of them before Goodreads. I consumed mystery thrillers almost exclusively, a lot of them actually psychological. So when I pick up a mystery, I'm almost immediately trying to figure out exactly what's happening, and maybe for some people they don't approach it that way, and so they get some satisfaction from it that I don't. Anyway, I've rambled about this enough. I think you know my thoughts and feelings on it by now. I will catch you next video.